Okay, let's go ahead and get started. I'm Charlie Smith, the Executive Director of ESIG. I want to welcome you to the first of our monthly webinars for 2022 and give you a little bit of background on ESIG. For those of you not familiar with ESIG, we're a membership-based nonprofit organization providing our members with objective information, resources, and networking opportunities in support of the energy transition. We do this through workshops, tutorials, webinars, blogs, working group and task force activities, and producing technical resource materials. I also serve in a leadership role with the Global Power System Transformation Consortium, the GPST, whose mission is to bring together key actors to catalyze a rapid, clean energy transition at unprecedented scope and speed. ESIG leads Pillar 1 of the 5 pillars, which deals with the research agenda for the system operators. More information on the GPST can be found at www.globalpst.org. We've been quite busy in spite of the COVID, just finishing up our end-of-year activities and preparing for the new year. We hope to be back in person with our spring technical workshop in Tucson, Arizona at the end of March. We're watching the virus situation closely, but right now I would say there's better than 50% chance that we will meet in person. Further information is available on our website. Our workshops and monthly webinars are open to everyone, so please feel free to register anytime on the ESIG website. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. ESIG membership will give you an opportunity to participate actively in all of our working groups and task forces. You can find us on the web at esig.energy, as well as on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid unnecessary distractions. For the Q&A, we're using the Slido platform. So to ask your questions, please go to slido.com and enter ESIG20 as the event code. The instructions are also at the bottom of this screen. You'll see a thumbs up button next to the questions to allow you to cast a vote to help prioritize the questions submitted. We plan to save 10 minutes or so for Q&A at the end and then wrap it up at the top of the hour. An email with a link will be provided once the video file has been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to ask your questions through Slido. Okay. Today's topic will be on the most recent findings from the IEA Wind Task 25 collaboration on grid integration of renewable energy. This is an international collaboration which began about 15 years ago. There are currently 17 countries participating, with representation from Europe, Asia, and North America. The webinar will be presented by Hannele Holttinen of Recognis, a Finnish consulting firm. Hannele has led the Task 25 work since its beginning. In addition, she leads Pillar 5 of the GPST on open source software and data. Hannele spent much of her career as a research scientist at the VTT Technical Research Center of Finland, where she worked initially on wind integration and later on energy system integration. Hannele is an internationally recognized expert in this area and a well-known face at ESIG. I feel very fortunate to have Hannele here with us today. She is both a professional colleague and a good friend. We've worked together on IEA Wind Task 25 since 2006, which is how I met her. We have 166 common connections on LinkedIn, many of whom we have met through our collaboration on Task 25. It's been a very rewarding experience developing friendships with so many good people from around the world, sharing our experiences and learning from each other. I think that's something we miss, and one of the reasons we want to get back together in person at ESIG meetings. Anyway, I consider Hannele a good friend and a good friend of ESIG, and it's a pleasure working with her. The webinar will summarize findings on wind and solar integration from around the world for the most recent 3-year period, including both study experience and operating experience. Hannele has a lot of material to cover, which she will only be able to cover at a high level, but there's plenty of additional detail in the final report. I greatly value Hannele's contributions to ESIG and the industry, and I look forward to what she has to say. Just a short reminder once again to use Slido at slido.com, with the event code of ESIG20 to ask your questions. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Hannele, I'll now turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Charlie, for the introduction. So indeed, I'm here as the operating agent of this international task and telling you about the report that was published in October. And I'm trying to cover in my presentation all the chapters of the report, which covers all the issues of wind and solar integration in power systems, mainly power systems, also somewhat energy systems. So I will show a lot of snapshots, but I mean, feel free to also ask questions in any of the examples I show, or generally about these topics, covering the initial variability and uncertainty, how to represent that, the planning issues, transmission, generation capacity planning, and the short-term reliability issues, and finally the operational issues covering flexibility and, well, the challenges ahead, pushing the limits towards 100% shares of renewables with the latest studies that we have. So to introduce, we have already quite a lot of experience accumulating in different countries and for different system operators. 11 states in the US, 9 in the EU have already more than 20% share of variable generation. And as we see also from the statistics of what is the average share that they have, and here is the graph for wind. When you have the average share, depending on system size, when you have it around 25%, then you can already start seeing hourly shares of 100%. Or when you go to 40% average share, you start seeing hourly and even daily shares of wind that reach 100%. Indeed, these are mostly covered for countries, these statistics, but what we really know about this, the challenges is when in a synchronous power system, you have more than 50% share of wind and wind or solar. And in these countries, then of course it's the Ireland and then Texas and Great Britain that are already sort of having the synchronous system where more or less where the country or state level is. But for the larger power systems, we still have sort of 10 to 15% share, which is of course also increasing quite fast. So the first thing, what we did actually quite a lot in the national work previously was really to look at the time series inputs to the integration studies, and to capture the smoothing impact that is really pronounced for wind. So now we have more and more real data that can be used, and also now we have better model data coming from meteorologists. But here are some examples. I just took a recent example of Europe. Wind Europe has quite nice statistics in their yearly reports of the whole Europe-wide wind and how it varies. What are the sort of common things when you have 200 gigawatts of wind installed all over Europe? So in wintertime, you usually see something between 60 to 80 gigawatts generation, and in summertime, 20 to 60 gigawatts. So this kind of things. And of course, also now we start seeing more and more solar also coming. And here is an example of France showing that, okay, capturing wind smoothing impact, but then also putting them together and with the complementarity is also important. And really improvements have been seen in data and models. So the simulated weather data has improved, and also forecasts. So the uncertainty of wind and solar is diminishing because the forecasts are improving. So this is also interesting. We have the Spanish system operator tool, forecasting tool, and how it has improved over the years, as an example here. And then one thing that is important is capturing the extreme events. So ramp forecasting, especially for storms. And we have also interesting results from Germany showing how much of the large wind forecast errors are actually due to storms. And then also another thing is for the longer term resource adequacy, how to capture the what in Germany they call the Dunkelflaut. It's no sun, no wind situation that can last longer, and how to predict them seems to be now okay for 3 to 4 days before, to see that this kind of longer event is coming. Actually, this picture shows more the red line 2 days before, quite well following the dotted line that has actually happened. And then going to the system impact study, starting with transmission planning. So this is what has been seen from the start. Transmission is critical. It's an enabler and also very cost efficient to build. And here is an example of France, just showing that how they experience the flows of one of their transmission lines now in light blue, and how they project it to be in 2035. So just showing that yes, it will be more fluctuating and also more of the transmission. And we see in all countries going for wind and solar that there are more investments to transmission, which can be partly integrated into renewals of aging assets. And also to get this actually built means, at least in Europe, that public engagement with citizens and social acceptance is also something that the system operators need to have a lot of efforts. Also, we see the benefits of looking for more than one country, looking at larger regional transmission planning. Here is an example from a recent ESIC publication summarizing nicely the transmission benefits of the larger interconnected system in the US, and even a macrogrid overlay. And the European example is from ENTSO-E, the European TSO group that publishes every 2 years their 10-year network development plan. And mainly, it has been also studied in Europe whether it would be beneficial to have a macrogrid overlay. So far, it looks like it's more cost efficient to go with the existing pretty well meshed grid already and reinforce that. But of course, in Europe, what we see as a big new, almost a macrogrid type of thing is the offshore grids. And there's a huge ambition for European Union and Great Britain to build more offshore wind power plants for reaching the net zero carbon targets, and also how to do that cost efficiently using meshed offshore grids, using offshore hubs. Energy islands is very interesting development. And still development, because most of these offshore wind power plants are still connected with radial lines to one country. And also the HVDC technology improvements are ongoing and indeed needed. Another example from the US, just showing very clearly that the more wind and solar we have in our future scenarios, the more benefits we have from inter-regional coordination and expansion. So, showing here some different scenarios where in the green you see more wind and solar, and then also the system value of transmission is higher. So the more you have wind and solar, the more value you have for this transmission expansion. Then for long-term reliability and security of supply, traditionally the wind integration studies looked at the capacity value of wind, also called capacity credit. And here we have an example of a recent study in in the US, just showing how this also develops when the technology develops. So offshore sites often have higher capacity value than onshore sites. And also the later technology. So the technology development is also advancing a little bit the capacity value that wind has. So of course, then looking at the power systems, then it's relevant to not to just look at the single sites shown here, but just to look at the whole area-wide wind power and even sort of neighboring areas where possible. Because if we have smaller areas, we see quite a strong decrease of the value when you increase your wind, if you have just a smaller size area. And then also what we have seen very clearly in some examples is that you really need a lot of data to get robust results. So in some countries, 10 years is enough, but in some other countries, 20 or even 30 years of data is needed to really get robust results and capture all the weather events. And ideally, this is calculated with probabilistic methods like loss of load probability, effective load carrying capability. And this is used for inputs for planning models, and also capacity markets need this kind of input for capacity value of wind. Moving towards the resource adequacy in future systems, this is again showing some nice work from ISIC, looking at really the improvements of the methods that we need for high share wind and solar systems of the future. It's important to include coordination with neighboring areas, have more data to reflect all the events, and also capture more about the potential loss of load. And here is an example just highlighting that even if you have your loss of load expectancy the same in different cases, then you can have either many quite sort of shallow and short problems coming, or you can have it so that there are actually part of these part of the events are really long lasting and severe events. So you need to start looking more in detail. And I think generally the tool development that we need is really high, because normally they don't capture chronology. And when we want to have resources like load and storage, then we need to also have the tools work differently. Then going for the short-term reliability thing. So first example is the operating reserve. This has been traditionally the first results of any wind integration study to show the impact of variability and uncertainty on the reserves that the system operators carry. And question is how much? And here is an example from a recent EU project, Sysflex, for one of their scenarios, just showing that the impact of reliability level. So so basically, if you can lower the reliability target a bit, you have a clear impact on the operating reserves that you need to carry. Generally, the trend is towards dynamic reserve setting, so closer to real time, and probabilistic methods also here. And okay, these are studies, but actually what is happening from experience can be strikingly different. And this is because at the same time as wind is increasing, or wind and solar in Germany, for example, in this upper graph, at the same time they have changed the operational practices. In Germany, sharing reserves with neighboring system operators was such a strong benefit in decreasing the reserves that even at the same time when wind and solar was going up, the overall need for reserves was going down. And another example is from Texas, where also them moving to a faster operation meant that the need for short-term reserve was going down, even if at the same time wind was going up. Then going to another short-term issue, and that's the stability. So far from the experience, what concerns have there been? So basically it has been about responses to fault situations. So how is the grid code setting, for example, starting to require that the wind power plants have fault right through, and then having the experience from South Australia, very severe storms, having a lot of lightnings, that actually you need to have many consecutive faults being able to ride through. So sorry, it should be consecutive faults that you need to ride through during a storm. And then also how you set the limits. So there have been some examples that you can't just set a limit and then suddenly you have tens of gigawatts of resources that will all trip at the same time. So so these kinds of things have been more about really the settings that are required in the connection. But more recently, there have been also some control interactions that have been seen in the UK, and that has been investigated in Australia. So far, local incidents, but in future really need to assess these more. And I think that the next DSIG webinar next week from Great Britain system operator will tell something more about this. For frequency stability, this was the main concern of the smaller system of the island of Ireland. So what they did was that they are doing, they limit wind. They have a so-called system non-synchronous penetration level that they follow. And if it goes over that, then wind is curtailed. And then as they get more and more wind, they have a program of enabling this to happen in the system operation, so that they started with 50% and quite soon went to 60%, and now they are already reaching 70 and 75% SP limit in their operation. For medium-sized systems, we have already seen that new tools to monitor inertia real time and day ahead are used, so that it's important that they check even if these situations are rare. And for larger systems, it hasn't been an issue really. But what has been noted in the European system is that the system splits could happen, and then again this can be more of an issue. And there's a recent ENTSO-E report actually looking at this more in detail that came out in December. So how to support frequency stability? So you can maintain your inertia by keeping synchronous machines running, sort of must-run generators. This is a very traditional way of doing it, which works in the beginning. You have other sources of synchronous inertia, like synchronous condensers, or you can speed up the frequency response. So this fast frequency response is actually coming in several places in Europe and in Texas also. So as a new frequency control service that will help the situations of low inertia. And this is a snapshot graph from a French study, just trying to figure out the sort of the cost, and once you start having more and more wind and solar, so the options, what are the most cost-effective options there. So synchronous condensers are more expensive, but will have a lot of benefit at higher shares. Also, some experience we already have that faster response is more valuable. This example is again from Texas, and it's not only because wind has so very well complying fast frequency response, but it's also other changes that ERCOT has been doing in their system. But wind definitely plays a role in here. It really helps in practice. And also they have studied that how much more valuable the fast response is, and having the same reliability impact from less megawatts if you have it faster. And also Hydro-Quebec recorded an event. They have been requiring, as in their grid code, this fast response from wind power plants. And when they had an event, they could actually then go back and see that wind was nicely supporting the system when recovering. Another stability issue is voltage stability. So one thing that happens when the inverter-based resources are replacing synchronous generators is that the short circuit currents are lower, and then the area voltage disturbance becomes higher, as the example of Italy here shows. And also a reduction in synchronizing torque is something that is also or started to be seen now. I think the Ireland case highlights quite well that when they first made a study in 2010 about reaching the 40% wind share, where they are now about there. So the voltage stability was not the issue, it was the frequency stability. But then looking further on, and also they have new, more ambitious targets for wind. So the constraint that they have had of having these Mastron generators, these minimum 8 synchronous machines operating at all times. So now they see that when they have more than 40% wind, that they need to relax this constraint. Otherwise, the curtailed amount of wind is too high. What is happening there is they have quite dispersed location of wind farms and different capability characteristics, and they combine, and then at the same time they have more high voltage cables coming. So also it becomes more complicated with the voltage control in the control room of the system operator. So so they have also now just introduced some new tools for that. Weak grids is another thing, because these dynamic stability issues increase sharply when you have higher shares of wind and solar, when you have a weak grid, and then you start seeing potentially more stability issues, and then also including the IBR, the inverter capabilities, will be then highly beneficial and needed. And damping is one thing that is also seen in weaker grids, the need for damping and how to tune that. Okay, so that was for the stability. Then going to more operational issues, we have sort of given the heading of maximizing wind energy value in operations. So before going to that, we have a small text and chapter there about estimating wind's value. When we started 15 years ago, integration cost was a concept that we really tried to study hard and look at the methods, and there were all these studies that had tried to calculate the costs needed for balancing. And after many years of hard work and a lot of discussions, it was concluded that we didn't find. I don't think there is a proper method of really doing this. So trying to capture a balancing cost or integration cost from the system is really challenging. And actually now recently there have been published some quite interesting cases that if you just put different resources at different timings, you just get different results for your integration cost calculations, just showing that it's becoming a bit arbitrary. So it is relevant to look at different options and pathways, but really looking at the total cost is what everybody can agree on. And increasingly, we need to assess the value of wind. So it's beyond the levelized cost of energy, it's also the value. And once we have cases of transparent and cost-reflective markets, we can actually see pretty much these sort of costs or lower value coming for wind in the markets. So this may be one way forward. Okay, then how to maximize the value. So first thing is, of course, to avoid curtailment as much as possible. So of course, a little bit of curtailment can be good and can be used beneficially and economically, but once the curtailment comes more than 10% of the yearly generation, there often is it will become also cost effective to try to reduce that. And Task 25 has had these collaborative articles where we have put together experience and statistics of curtailed wind, and then put them here in the order of how much is the share of wind on average. And you can actually see quite strikingly that, yes, the largest ones have been in the beginning for China and Italy and ERCOT, and Italy and ERCOT was delay of the transmission infra, so they dropped immediately when the transmission was in place. For China, the transmission has also helped, but another reason has been some inflexibilities in their generation assets and tariffs. So, so both of these are needed to get the curtailments down. So what has been really nice to report is that China has been getting hold of its very high curtailment levels. But then again, at the same time, we see that in Europe, in Ireland, Denmark, and Germany and UK, we also see that the shares of wind are getting higher and higher, and then it also impacts the curtailments. We also see that some countries do have some market-based curtailments, so they are actually bidding down regulation and getting paid, which is not shown in these graphs. So this is, of course, also happening. For future wind scenarios, estimating curtailments is actually a very interesting result. And there was, again, a joint journal article putting together many results from studies for 30 to 40% share of wind. And one of the latest one is now case Canada, where also you could see that, okay, 20% wind share, they were going to more than 6% level of curtailment, but not more than that. And then a really more high share of wind was studied in the US in the NARIS scenarios, and there you could actually see that, yes, there is somewhere curtailment occurring in the US almost every hour, but the bulk is still occurring in small percentage of the hours. Another thing, okay, curtailments can be actually used for providing ancillary services or grid support. And what has been shown in some studies is that once you reach more than 20% share of wind and solar, then it is cost effective that some wind and solar power plants are offering this service, because that enables some of the other power plants to shut down and gives more room for all of the wind fleet. But it doesn't, it doesn't need to be much. It can be like 10 or 20% of the wind fleet providing this service, and then it will benefit all. So there is system value for that. There is already experience for several power systems for frequency control and balancing markets. Here is an example of Spain, where they have year by year being more and more wind power plants are doing the compliance tests and complying, and they have several services, but they mainly use it for the a bit slower tertiary frequency control, where some statistics here just showing that it's more used, of course, for downward reserve, and it's also a little bit increasing year by year how much they use it. And also, as shown before, having wind power plants provide faster response, it's good compliance, there's good value for the system shown. And then about new services, that's also studied. So having a power oscillation damping, having synchronizing power, restoration services, and the grid forming inverters. So all these are already studied, not really used, but sort of preparing the system for future really high share wind and solar. And then there is, of course, discussion on how should these be compensated. So which of the services could be offered for free in sort of just required in grid codes, but which of the services could actually in future be paid for. Perhaps also voltage in future, and the really faster frequency control services also that nowadays in many systems are not paid for. And then also when you have new system services, to introduce them at the time when it's really needed, because it's also frustrating if you introduce a new service and then people do efforts and trying to comply with them, and then they never get called for. So yeah, the system needs and the system services is definitely something that needs to be studied a lot. For the operational practices of grid, so there is a lot that can be done to reduce congestion management, which can be one of the reasons of curtailing wind. And generally, of course, then increasing efficiency of how you use your existing grid is important. So basically, all the margins that you have, you can really use stochastic weather forecast and use probabilistic methods and try to get these security margins right, and sort of as little as possible, but still having the reliability you want. You can use dynamic line ratings, you can use advanced power flow control, different like phase shifting transformers. Here is an example of the Italy system and what they have already built and are building there. They have had in Italy a real challenge having most of the wind in the south and most of the demand in the north. Topology optimization is something where there are some examples in the report of the French system operator, what can be achieved. And also here looks like the more you have wind and solar, the more benefit you have from these kinds of methods. Also in Europe, there's a lot of talk about the TSO-DSO coordination, so the distribution system operators or the distribution utilities become also system operators and have more control over the resources that are built in their grid, but how to make sure that the flexibility resources are used for the common good when possible, but still securing the secure operation of the distribution system. Flexibility is a really big topic for many studies, and it's really a main enabler of larger shares of wind and solar. And we have seen many examples how the thermal power plants can be retrofitted to be more flexible. You can use combined heat and power and heat pumps with heat storage and provide a lot of flexibility and coupling from heat to electricity. Increased transmission has always very good cost benefit in the studies, always, at least what I've seen. Hydropower is very valuable where you can have it, both pumped hydro and larger reservoirs. And storage is emerging, but the price of batteries are getting lower and lower and starts to be on the level where it really becomes interesting for also power system applications. And then demand response, and sometimes storage is sort of part of demand response, like with electric vehicles, for example. That the consumers have some assets that have storage and can be used. And then For the longer term flexibility, actually these new types of loads, power to X, producing hydrogen or any derivatives of hydrogen is very interesting and can be made in a way that is more flexible. Here I have some examples from Denmark. So the first example is just showing the value of their existing flexibility. They have some scenarios and they simulated how the market prices would have been if the flexibility that they have, which is mostly the flexibility of a lot of interconnections to neighbors and their thermal flexibility. So what if they didn't have that flexibility? How would the market price have been? And then for wind power, the changes would have been really, really high. So Denmark still doesn't have a lot of so-called profile losses. So wind power plants get close to the average market price for day-ahead markets, even if they have 50% wind on average. And this is mainly due to having extremely well-used flexibility of the interconnections between neighbors. And what they are looking at for the future is that another new flexibility may come. So here are some duration curves of market prices for Denmark. And if you just increase wind as much as they plan, you would have a lot of zero prices and very low prices, so more than half of the year. But when you introduce electrolyzers producing different power to X products, then they can take use of this cheaper prices and then also have a stabilizing effect on the prices. So this is a very important flexibility for the future of very high shares of wind. Little bit summarizing, it's also about market design, but it's, you know, flexibility to avoid the low price energy and larger and faster markets. All this will help in maintaining the value of wind in the future, and also providing grid support from wind and solar is another way of increasing the value of wind. And there you need to have the market design such that wind power plants can bid. So close to delivery and smaller amounts of megawatt or only bidding down regulation are the things that make a difference when you have wind power plants in the markets. Then finally, pushing the limits. We see more and more studies coming looking at 100% renewables or towards close to 100% renewables, and where the renewables are mostly wind and solar. And what we have seen in experience, some interesting cases. One is that Denmark is operating one of the areas where most of the wind is, the West Denmark area, already without central power plants. So they have really done a lot in their system operation to enable that they can close down all the larger power plants in the area. And they take the system support mainly from the HVDC links to Norway, but they also have synchronous compensators, and then they have some small scale power plants operating. And you can see here, it's marked in red, that on a Wednesday in December several years ago was the first event that they actually did it. So the yellow is then showing exports. So there were no gray color big power plants there at all. But this is what is happening in Denmark now more regularly. Another interesting example is from an island system in Hawaii, where they have been operating with about 90% PV. So what they do, they have the diesel reciprocating engines as fast reserves and in synchronous condenser mode, and also to cover for passing cloud events, to hold some of the PV curtailed, and then they can have a spinning contingency reserve from PV as well. So we have these towards 100% renewable power system studies, and more we also see that there is electrification foreseen. So actually the demand is a new kinds of demand are coming to the power systems. Most of these studies look at the hourly energy balances, so really not looking at stability effects. But anyway, getting a feasibility that that the energy balances would be okay, even if you have wind and solar covering most of the load. Here is an example from a recent EU study, how the electricity demand will increase, and a US study for transmission expansion, which is another common theme in these studies, and also showing that if you can have transmission expansion, then really solar, wind, and batteries will give you the most cost optimal system. Going on, there are more net zero carbon studies coming, where the all energy sectors are captured and they're coupling. Again, the studies we have so far, it's just looking at the energy balances, no stability, and then how you do this, how much you have liquid fuels remaining in your system, and how much is direct electrification. There are many different pieces of the puzzle that this can be put together in future, and I'm sure there will be many more studies coming up. For the stability, that is then something that still needs work to do. And GPST, I think one of the main reasons that the Global Power System Transformation Consortium was built up with the system operators is really looking at this this challenge. We have some first studies showing, for example, Great Britain system and Ireland system, how this could be, how it could be with grid forming and grid following, a combination of grid forming and grid following wind power plants. And then, of course, it's interesting to look at how much grid forming you actually need. So these are one of the first studies from EU Project Migrate, showing the feasibility. And yes, pushing the limits and making these studies, you really need some tool development when you start looking at these towards 100% studies, power systems dominated by wind and solar. There will be more complexity, need for higher resolution, need for simulating large areas, and integrated planning and operational and stability tools. So somehow they need to be linked more, and also the constraints coming from the other models need to be seen in the other models, and also some new paradigms also are needed, like cost versus risk, how you think about future resource adequacy, for example. Okay, so to conclude, wind and solar, we call them VIBERs, the variable inverter-based resources. They will make a large contribution to future decarbonized energy systems for sure. And they do have potential to even form the backbone of the future power systems when the full range of inverter capabilities are used. However, we do need some new paradigms of non-synchronous power system operation, and also new paradigms for how you look at long-term resource adequacy. We get a lot of experience from operating and planning the systems with large amounts of wind and solar, and research to tackle the challenges is well on the way. and we see a lot of opportunities for inverter-based resources, and also a lot of opportunities coming from energy transition and digitalization, bringing new types of flexibility that so far we haven't seen. Okay, so this was my presentation, my acknowledgement to the large group of co-authors in this report, and then thank you with my contact information, and then going towards the Q&A. I'm having two colleagues from Task 25, Bethany Frew from NREL and Damien Finn from UCD Ireland, with me to capture the trickier questions that I can give to them, hopefully.
Okay, Hannele, thank you for that very comprehensive walk through the history of the collaboration of the IEA. And Damien and Bethany, welcome to the panel. The history just made me think as we were going through. You've been doing this for 15 years now, Hannele, leading this activity. I'm just curious, from your own perspective, how have you seen things evolve in the integration landscape over that time? You're kind of looking backwards. What's your view of how things have taken shape, changed?
Well, I must say that when I first started the first 3-year phase, I was sure that, yeah, we would need several of them, but I would never have thought that the field keeps evolving so fast and quickly that every 3 years I look back and I look sort of, well, what needs to be done, and there are always new challenges coming, but also always new opportunities emerging. So, I mean, like these grid forming inverters, I mean, as soon as we start saying that, hey, what can we do when there is suddenly 100% wind and solar in the system? And then somebody says, hey, we have grid forming converters. And it's like, so somehow, yeah, it has evolved a lot. And what has been really nice is that it's not just challenges, also the opportunities are evolving at the same pace.
Yeah, that is interesting looking back. That it never ends. There's a lot that's been done and a lot that remains to be done. The grid forming inverters and the 100% is an interesting area. And since we have Damien on the line here, I wonder if, Damien, you could say just a few words about that Irish 100% study that Hannele mentioned a few slides back.
Yes, certainly. So this was part of a European project called Migrate, and it was trying to ask the question, if we get to the situation where it's, let's say, just wind and PV on the system, what share of the converters would actually need to be grid forming? And the reason there's sort of two maps in Ireland here is that the map on the left is assuming that the converters would be in the locations of the existing generators. The reason for doing that is that if they're in existing locations, it means that you don't really have to develop your network. So it was sort of used as a reference case. Wind and PV in reality are going to be in remote locations, particularly wind. So if you look at the sort of the figure on the right, which is showing in particular the grid forming converters, it's got many more little red and pink dots on the sort of the left of the island, which is where a lot of the wind is going to be. And what we saw is that if you have the converters in the traditional locations, perhaps you need 40% of them to be grid forming. If you can actually have them distributed around the island, and particularly on the west, you can actually reduce that to maybe 30%. So distributing around the system actually helps from a voltage support point of view, network loading point of view, stability point of view.
I think those are important questions and answers. How much do you need? Where do you need it? It's interesting insights. I'm sure we'll get more of those as more study work is done. And Bethany, since you've joined us, I know that you're working a lot in the resource adequacy area, and Hannele mentioned a few things that need to be done there still. Do you want to offer any perspective on the resource adequacy challenges and opportunities?
Sure, Charlie. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of momentum in this area, especially in response to some of the events that have happened in the United States over the past couple of years. A lot of recognition, as Hannele mentioned, for needing better methods and tools as well as data to support those tail events, these events where you have correlated outages across generators, but also interfacing with the gas network, for example, understanding the role that transmission can have in connecting different regions together that maybe didn't have as strong of ties in the past, and how the pooling of resources via transmission can help to enhance resource adequacy and overall reliability. So I think those are some of the hot topics within resource adequacy. Market design, of course, and understanding how markets can help to signal for the resources and the attributes needed to ensure resource adequacy. So I think just a lot of enhancing the linkages between different facets of the system to make sure that we're using all of the resources and capabilities that exist and compensating them appropriately to support resource adequacy.
Okay, thank you for those those thoughts. Let's go ahead and move to the Slido. I see we've got a lot of questions here. One from Russ for our European colleagues. Future resources need to be valued for their reliability contribution, even if not called for energy. What is the European perspective on paying for capacity? Are you wrapped around the wheel with capacity issues like we are here in the US?
There is a lot of talk on that, and ENTSO-E has been developing a methodology for multi-area, capturing the multi-area issues of looking at resource adequacy, because it's clear that if every country and system operator makes its own calculations, they will start building a lot of backup that will not be needed in a well-meshed common European market. So actually what they did was that they said that before you can start paying capacity payments for any of your generators, especially the fossil fired generators, you need to prove that, taking into account the interconnections to your neighbors, you really need it. And this is like well, at least one part of the picture. But I think for the tool development, it has been very interesting to see how ENTSO-E has been developing the tools, because they are using a chronological tool that can capture then in future also other things perhaps easier than the previous tools that were used.
Yeah, thanks for that, Hannele. I think we'll hear a little bit more about that in the upcoming ESIG workshop in March also. Next question, Hannele, this may be one you want to deflect to Bethany, I don't know. You said that Dunkelflaut can be predicted more accurately 2 to 3 days out. Have you seen any studies on how to capture Dunkelflaut events in RA studies?
I think this is one of the challenges that has been mentioned, that you need a lot of data to capture these events. I don't know, Bethany, you may want to say more, but I would just say that having many years of data, you would capture these.
Yeah, I don't specifically know on the Dunkelflaut event, but I think just generally, how do you incorporate these types of, and maybe this isn't considered an extreme event, but events where you have very stressful conditions, how do you capture those within the data? So yeah, just reiterating what Hannele said, and then making sure that the tools have the ability to, that you have a way to compare a case where you're able to have that foresight, where you can see the events coming and the impact that that type of foresight can have. So, maybe kind of that's maybe getting more into the operational side, but there's a lot of talk about what sort of foresight we should be using in our tools, so that you're able to see that information and respond appropriately, both operationally, but accounting for that within the RA tools as well.
Okay, thank you, Bethany. I'm going to skip over the next one since we just got a question from Russ, and go to the fast frequency response question. Is the fast frequency response a centralized transmission level FFR, or is it more of a distributed FFR? I guess they're talking about the source of the fast frequency response that was mentioned in the studies.
Would you know, Damien, how it is in Ireland? Ireland, I think, was the first to introduce this new service.
I mean, I think in general, it can either come from traditional sources, which would be your conventional generators, but it can also come from new sources such as batteries or wind turbines. So I think in Ireland and possibly in other countries as well, such as Sweden, I'm not too sure that location is actually considered, whether it's connected to the transmission or the distribution. That's more focused on the volume that's available.
Okay. Thank you, Damien. I think we've got time for one more question. We'll go to the following one. You mentioned that the connection cost can't be accurately estimated for wind. I think this was the wind value mentioned, Hannele. How do we create competitive markets if the value or cost can't be quantified?
Yeah, I think what you refer to with connection cost is the integration cost notion, that can't be accurately estimated. That's right. Well, actually, what we see if we have transparent markets, so we see that the power plants are paying for the connection to the grid. They are seeing the market value of their sort of day ahead energy. They are paying for their imbalances. So they are sort of paying themselves for the balancing cost and what has been previously mentioned as a sort of profile cost, that generally the variability over days and weeks and months, how to cover for that. So that I think will be covered in the market income that they get. And then if there is also a capacity market, it may be that they can get a little bit from that, but not a lot. So in a way, I think going for future markets, I think we can basically capture these, at least if the markets are ideal as we normally assume they are.
Yeah. We don't need to know what we calculate as long as we know how people value it. Okay, well, it's a little past the top of the hour, actually, so I think we're going to need to wrap it up. I want to thank Hannele and Damien and Bethany for their participation, and this was a really informative presentation, Hannele, and I think everybody found something to take away from it. As I mentioned earlier, we've got about probably a dozen or more questions unanswered, so an email will go out once the video file has been posted, and we'll answer the questions we didn't get to and get them posted as quickly as possible. We appreciate your engagement and look forward to seeing you again soon. Next Tuesday, Hannele already mentioned this, will feature a joint GPST ESIG webinar on grid stability and high IBR networks, presented by National Grid ESO in Great Britain, to which everyone is welcome. Further information on all of our webinars and meetings can be found on our website at esig.energy under events and in our newsletters and informational emails, and you're all invited to attend. Hannele, thank you once again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank all of you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you again in the near future, and in the meantime, everyone, take care, stay safe, and thanks for your participation. See you soon. Bye-bye.